Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. After World War II, many countries were upset about the horrors of war, the Holocaust, and the general depravity of how we treated each other in times of hostile conflict. In response, these countries said enough is enough, formed the United Nations, and supported a comprehensive list of rights and freedoms that would be considered fundamental to all people, like not killing each other, scaling back torture and maltreatment, supporting freedom of expression, the right to work, to be educated, access to health care, practice a religion of your choice, and so on. Now, more than 7 decades later, how is this experiment in global governance working? Are we making any progress? Let's discuss this with a scholar, expert, and someone who has had a seat at the human rights table at the United Nations headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. Well, warm greetings. I am really looking forward to our discussion today with Dr. Alfred de Zayas. Greg and I have been on vacation for 3 weeks or so. So you are the first person we've had on, and it's good to be back in the saddle doing our podcast again. And let me just give our guests a little bit of background. You are a prominent scholar, lawyer, historian, and human rights expert, and that's really what we'd like to chat with you about is your expertise in that area. You've got a law degree from Harvard and a Ph.D. in history from University of Göttingen in Germany. I didn't say that right. Pronounce that for me.
Göttingen. It's very close to Hanover. It was Einstein's university.
Oh,
very prominent people, Max Planck, everybody was there.
Well, I came across you from your book, The Human Rights Industry, and it took me a while to realize that you have a trilogy of 3 books that are every year in the fall. You have published the Building a Just World Order. The second book is Countering Mainstream Narratives. That was my favorite. And the third book is The Human Rights Industry.
Yeah.
And I've read.
I get me even more friends and enemies than I have. The human rights industry is something I've been wanting to write for the last 20 years, and I finally got around to it.
Right. And anyway, you are a prolific writer, writing for a variety of, Counterpunch, various different. Truth Out, and blog. I'll link all this in our show notes. So welcome to the podcast.
My priority, and everything in life is priorities. My priority right now is to contribute to peacemaking. I am quite concerned, together with my friend Jeff Sachs, with my friend Richard Falk, with Stephen Kinzer, that this European querelle over whether Ukraine owns Crimea or Russian owns Crimea, we're not going to fight a nuclear war over that. I mean, boundaries have changed over the centuries multiple times, and we're not going to risk the planet over something like that. So whether we like it or not, Russia exists. Whether we like it or not, China exists. So let's have a modus vivendi. We don't have to look at them as our best friends. We don't have to love them. We don't have to admire them. But we also do not unilaterally make enemies out of them.
Right.
And if you provoke somebody, if you bark at somebody, that somebody is going to bark back. And that is the main problem, which, by the way, the mainstream media has simply not properly reported. I mean, this war did not start on the 24th of February 22. It started on the 22nd of February of 2014. 9 years ago. It started with an illegal, vulgar coup d'etat against a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president of all Ukrainians. You don't like Yanukovych? I don't like him either. Okay, wait 2 years and throw him out in the next elections. But you don't, you don't commit horrendous acts of violence in Maidan, of course, financed and organized by us because we had an interest in that. And Victoria Nuland was there telling the American ambassador whom we wanted for prime minister and whom we wanted for minister of defense, et cetera, et cetera. It's shocking. And it's public. I mean, you can see it in YouTube. And nothing, the narrative you get from the New York Times and the Washington Post is that we are the good guys. We are the Democrats. And the Russians are the baddies. It's not that simple.
Right. We had Dan Kovalik on. He just got back from a peace trip there, and it was, when you actually see the pictures and you study the history and how that part of the Europe has kind of been a dividing point for years and years. It's amazing how much I learned just from looking at his vacation pictures, if you will,
well,
and
Dan is a very
understanding
good man, and he's a good scholar. And myself, back in 1994, that is almost 30 years ago, I was the representative of the Secretary General for the elections in Ukraine twice, in March for the parliamentary elections, in June for the presidential elections. I met Kravchuk and I met Kuchma, and I crisscrossed the country, went to the east, and there's no question Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian. And the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk and Kherson, etc., is also very largely Russian, and they feel Russian. This is an issue of self-determination. And by the way, the Minsk agreements, which I've read, I've studied, I find them very reasonable. The Minsk agreements did not provide for independence or secession of Donetsk and Lugansk. It provided for autonomy. That's what we call in international law terms internal self-determination. And that would have been a perfect solution. We would have had no war. The problem is that, as we know from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, in its reports, 80% of the shelling and of the violations of the Minsk agreements came from Ukraine. And as you know, and that was a very clear provocation in January of 2022, Zelensky signed the order to invade, to take Donetsk and Lugansk by force. And imagine, just by analogy, imagine that Vučić, the president of Serbia, would decide that he's going to invade Kosovo and is going to reincorporate Kosovo into Serbia. I mean, the world would break out and protest violation of self-determination, et cetera, et cetera. And in the case of Donetsk and Crimea, which is very clear, it's a self-determination issue.
Right.
The Western media and the Western politicians say, oh no, territorial integrity and borders are sacred, et cetera, et cetera. Such double standards.
Right.
It takes, the credibility away from the institutions.
I'd like to go back just a little bit, because until I read your book, frankly, I didn't know what a rapporteur was. UN. You worked for the United Nations. Well, explain what a rapporteur is, and so we can get a general idea of what you've spent a good part of your career doing at the United Nations.
Well, before I joined the United Nations, I was a lecturer in law at the University in Göttingen. Then I went to the Max Planck Institute on public international law in Heidelberg. That is more or less the Academy of International Law in Germany. And it's from there that Theo van Boven, the then director of the Human Rights Office, picked me up, and I joined the United Nations in January of 1981. And then I was the senior lawyer for the Human Rights Committee. Human Rights Committee is the specialized quasi-judicial organ established to monitor compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So I was the registrar. I mean, all petitions ran through me. Petitions for the Human Rights Committee, Committee Against Torture, Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and wrote, most of the jurisprudence, because it's usually the Secretariat that writes the decisions. And I wrote a book about it called The Human Rights Committee Case Law, and a book that was sold very well at the time. And then I decided that I wanted to go back to academia, and I left in 2003 after 22 years of being a United Nations senior official. Then I taught as the Douglas Mackay Brown Chair in International Law at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I taught at DePaul University in Chicago. I taught at the Human Rights Institute in Galway in Ireland. I taught at the University of Trier in Germany. I gave the master's course in Alcalá de Henares in Spain, that is just outside of Madrid, one of the oldest Spanish universities, at the Institut de Droit Constitutionnel at Tunis, etc. So I loved, this period of my career as an academic, and published a great deal. And then I was more or less recycled out of my retirement and became the first United Nations independent expert on international order. So it's in this capacity, 6 years working for the office as an independent expert, as a rapporteur, that I actually learn how the system works. Because when you're a member of the Secretariat, you only see some of the comings and goings. But once you are a rapporteur, and you're dealing with governments, and you're dealing with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and the whole instrumentarium, you see the good and the bad, and the bad and the good. As the case may be, I produced 14 reports for the Human Rights Council and for the General Assembly, and reports on all sorts of issues, on the right to peace, on the right of self-determination of all peoples, not only former colonies, and on the International Monetary Fund, on the World Bank and Development, and on free trade agreements, on investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, on the reform of the United Nations. I made very concrete reform proposals for the Security Council, among others. And I published all of that, by the way, in Building a Just World Order. Now, Building a Just World Order has a set of principles, what are called the Zayas principles on international order, 25 principles, which, if applied, obviously, you wouldn't have the situation that we have today. But of course, I'm not discovering the wheelbarrow, nor am I discovering the Mediterranean either. I mean, obviously, my 25 principles are based on the United Nations Charter. They're based on key resolutions of the General Assembly, like 2625, that is the Friendly Relations Resolution, Resolution 3314, the definition of aggression, etc. And essentially, the 25 principles have been well received. The then president of the General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, she called my 25 principles a Magna Carta for the 21st century. The problem is that the United Nations is not one individual, is not one leader. It's 193 states, plus observer states, plus civil society, etc. It is immensely complex, and there are all sorts of competitions going on and jealousies going on. And so we're not, I won't say we are dysfunctional, but we are not as effective as we should be. And that's why the United Nations has lost a lot of credibility. But one of the things that I say in the human rights industry, which is not well received in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is that if you look at what's coming out of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, if you look at the resolutions that are adopted in the Human Rights Council, you realize that we are more or less in the service of Washington and Brussels. And there's whole aspects that are simply ignored. And I am very concerned that an institution that is very important, very necessary, like the Human Rights Council, like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, essentially is hijacked, essentially is penetrated by interests that are not human rights interests. And then human rights, instead of being entitlements, your right to be you, my right to be me, my right to my own identity, to my own opinion, to my own ideas, etc., that's not the name of the game. The name of the game is scoring points against a geopolitical rival. So you use human rights to accuse Russia or China or Cuba or Venezuela of violating human rights and thereby demonizing them so that you can engage in interventionism, so that you can sell your interventionism as something more noble, not just brazen imperialism or neo-colonialism. You call it then humanitarian intervention. And I would call it humanitarian imperialism. In any event, I do have a rather grim diagnosis for the office, but I also formulate a prognosis. I formulate very concrete, pragmatic proposals how to fix the system. But in order to fix the system, you also need a change of mindset. I'm an American citizen. I'm also a Swiss citizen. But the fact is that we in the United States tend to believe, and certainly my high school education, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and for the country for which it stands, etc., is that we are by definition the good guys. We simply do not conceive that we make mistakes. Otherwise, what were we doing in Vietnam? What were we doing in Afghanistan? What were we doing in Iraq? Were these not aggressions? Were these not war crimes and crimes against humanity? But we have a very underdeveloped sense of self-criticism. And if that doesn't change, we will be incapable of making peace. And I am dismayed at seeing the hawks in the Republican Party. I used to be in the Republican Club at Harvard Law School, and the hawks in the Democratic Party. And whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, what do you get? You get warmongering, you get the military industrial complex, you get more Wall Street and no Main Street, you get Israel, and nobody gives a damn about the Palestinians or for that matter, as I was talking to you before we started recording, the genocide going on right now against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Nobody remembers that in September 2020, Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, aggressed Nagorno-Karabakh, committed horrendous crimes, including torture, all well documented by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. The world doesn't care because, as I said, we don't care about the victims of the Armenians. We have other geopolitical interests in the area. So nobody is talking about the fact that today, as we're talking, people are starving in Nagorno-Karabakh because they have a total blockade from Azerbaijan. And of course, Azerbaijan does more or less what Erdogan, what Turkey allows Azerbaijan to do. I mean, the big power here is Erdogan. And Erdogan does some good things, but many, many, many bad things, like Ecevit. I mean, they invaded, they killed God knows how many people in Cyprus in 1974. They expelled 200,000 Greeks from the north. You know, Cyprus has been Greek for 5,000 years. And here you have Greeks whose ancestors lived in the north of Cyprus for generations and generations and generations, expelled overnight from the north to the south, and completely fascist invasion, and got away with it.
Right.
I mean, did
So-
anybody want to bring Ecevit before an international criminal court or have an ad hoc tribunal against them? Of course not. Do we want to do it against Erdogan because of his crimes in Syria? Also not. Nobody cares. I mean, we are only interested in demonizing Russia and China and Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, and then have the gall to use human rights to do that. That's why I talk about the human rights industry. Now, here is one of my heroes whom I personally interviewed, Julian Assange. I went to see him in 2015 at the Ecuadorian embassy in London because Assange had just released super confidential memos concerning the free trade agreements. You know, the free trade agreements are a bonanza for business, and they're horrendous for the rule of law. I mean, the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is a way of circumventing the rule of law, circumventing the system of public courts, and then giving it to some so-called arbitrators who almost invariably decide for the transnational corporation and cut the regulatory function of the state. So I showed you the book, the trial of Julian Assange by my friend, Professor Niels Meltzer. He was at the time the rapporteur on torture, and certainly Julian Assange has been subjected to psychological torture, to sleep deprivation, horrendous things, and the world doesn't seem to care. What Niels Meltzer revealed in this book published in Verso Books in New York in 2022 is a breakdown in the administration of justice, in the rule of law, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, in Ecuador, the manner in which the human rights of Julian Assange were grossly violated with impunity. And well, Niels Meltzer, now he's the chief legal officer of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And again, the book is an incredibly important book. On the other hand, belongs in that category of books. I wrote about that in countering mainstream narratives. It belongs to the category of books without consequences. You know about it, but you don't talk about it. So you know this is worse than the Dreyfus affair of 1898. You know that this is worse than Émile Zola's J'accuse when he was revealing the dysfunction of the military courts in France. But when you have a UN rapporteur revealing the dysfunctions in the administration of justice in the US, UK, Sweden, and Ecuador, the press ignores it.
Right.
I mean,
I'm gonna stop you here because we're about a third of the way through, and I want to get Greg. I want to get Greg involved in the conversation. Sure. Greg, what do you think? What are some questions you might have?
I think this is incredible. I mean, a very convincing argument, very compelling discussion of what's going on, but it kind of leads you to a certain level of cynicism, to a level of cynicism. So I have to ask the question, you know, we've seen the failure of the League of Nations, which was also created around high-minded goals and principles, but it failed abysmally. And now we have a UN, which you've been a part of, and you've painted a picture of how it's abused. I think a very accurate picture. I have no doubt that everything you said and much, much more that we'll get into just points to the fact that it's failing. So why should we believe that there isn't any real hope for an international organization, any international control over the great powers, just as there was no control over the great powers before World War I? They had meetings in Vienna and other places prior to that. We had meetings after World War I designed to keep the peace. And I really appreciate you putting peace in the forefront as the most compelling, most overwhelming, important fact. But how can we get out of this muck, to put it very crudely?
Well, of course, humans are imperfect. And since humans are imperfect, any human institution is going to be imperfect. And we have allowed it, we have tolerated it, that intelligence services have penetrated the system. I myself, on 2 occasions, was approached by the CIA to become a mole. And I said, look, temperamentally, I'm not capable. I am the worst possible spy in the world. I mean, I just never learned how to dissimulate, never learned how to hide my feelings, so you can read my feelings on my face. But going back to the organization, I do applaud the organization for a phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal performance in standard setting. Without a doubt, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of Eleanor Roosevelt, Charles Malik, René Cassin, and P.C. Chang is an incredibly important document. The 10 core human rights treaties, because the declaration is not a treaty, so it's not enforceable. However, the treaties are the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention Against Torture. All of this is an enormous achievement. And then you have monitoring bodies. I myself was secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and I met incredibly brilliant, committed, honest, decent people in the Human Rights Committee. I can tell you Christian Tomushat, Christine Chanet, Torkel Opsahl. I dedicated this book to the late Torkel Opsahl. He was the expert from Norway. And I've met enormously committed people from Amnesty International. Take Peter Splinter here in Geneva. Take Bernard Dam from Human Rights Watch, etc. There are very many good people in the system, but of course there are bad apples. And that is what I'm trying to indicate. We should not tear it down. We need it. The United Nations saved the world from apocalypse back in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, if we had not had the forum that allowed Adlai Stevenson III to debate Valentin Zorin. I remember I was a high school student in Chicago at the time, and I watched it on television. And I was, of course, afraid. Even we had a nuclear shelter at home. As the case may be, we really were concerned that the world could end, that nuclear war would hit us. And the United Nations allowed the two major powers to give off steam, to exchange their arguments. And in the end, both Khrushchev and Kennedy decided that they were not going to destroy the world, that they would make a compromise, a quid pro quo. The US took the missiles out of Turkey, and Russia took the missiles out of Cuba. And that was a sensible deal. And now in the Ukraine, we had many sensible deals. I mean, the two treaties that Sergei Lavrov put on the table in December 2021 are extremely reasonable, moderate, a good basis for lasting peace in Europe. What happened? Jens Stoltenberg, I still remember hearing him saying, Putin, he says he doesn't want to have NATO at his frontier. Well, I have news for him. He's not going to have less NATO. He's going to have a lot more NATO. I mean, that is throwing the gauntlet in front of the man. And Putin, unfortunately, picked it up. And the fact is, Putin was taken for a ride. Putin negotiated together with the French, the Germans, and the Ukrainians, negotiated the Minsk I and Minsk II agreement. As we know now, both Angela Merkel, at that time German Chancellor, and Francois Hollande, at that time French president, both admitted that they actually only entered the Minsk agreements in order to gain time, so that the Ukrainian army could be properly trained, and so that Ukraine could have the necessary weapons to attack the people of Donetsk and Lugansk. But the fact is, here we have a crucial issue of self-determination. As the International Court of Justice explained in its advisory opinion of 2010 on Kosovo, territorial integrity is not absolute, and territorial integrity can only be used externally. It cannot be used against your own people. If your own people are demanding self-determination, then you have to address those grievances. And that's what happened in Kosovo. Milosevic canceled the autonomous status of Kosovo, and that led to the creation of the Kosovo Liberation Army, etc., and the war and NATO's intervention. By the way, NATO's intervention in 1999 was clearly a violation of the UN Charter. So when I hear people saying, "Oh, Putin, he has he's an aggressor, he has violated international law, he has violated the UN Charter," sure, he did. But so did we. The fact is that NATO's interventions in Yugoslavia were illegal. They were not backed up by a resolution of the United Nations Security Council under Chapter 7. Same thing goes for Afghanistan, for Iraq. There was a resolution, by the way, with regard to Libya. That was Resolution 1973 of 2011, and that's the one that was. That's how you see how human rights can be weaponized. The Security Council adopts a resolution supposedly for humanitarian assistance of the people in Libya. And that was then misused by NATO to bomb the hell out of Gaddafi and eventually get Gaddafi killed. And 12 years later, you have total chaos in Libya. So I remember discussing this with a Russian diplomat in New York, because one of my reports to the General Assembly proposed doing away with the veto power, and how to, not from one day to the other, gradually, requiring not one but two vetoes, and limiting the number of subjects which you could veto. In any event, it's an interesting proposal, I think quite viable. In any event, the Russian diplomat told me, look, Zayas, we trusted the US, France, and Great Britain back in 2011. We did not vote for Resolution 1973, but we abstained. So the resolution went through. That will not happen to us again. We trusted you, and you took a resolution that was intending to do humanitarian assistance in order to wage an all-out war and get regime change. US, UK, and France bear an enormous guilt for the disaster that visited Libya and that continues to visit Libya. So don't expect the Soviet Union, or rather the Russian Federation, to cooperate with the West until the West becomes trustworthy. One of the greatest mistakes of the West, as George Foster Kennan wrote in the New York Times back in 1997, a fatal error. The Eastern expansion of NATO against oral agreement in 1989, 1990, 1991 that had been given by George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, to Gorbachev. Again, if you break your word on something as fundamental as that, and you must realize that your credibility has suffered, that the other party is not going to believe you. Whatever you're saying, they won't believe you anymore because they trusted you once and you lied to them. It's the same thing. Who believes American propaganda? If you recall all the propaganda run-up to the Iraq war with the weapons of mass destruction and the idea that Saddam Hussein wanted to build an atomic bomb. I mean, if you read the New York Times and the Washington Post in the months of January, February, and early March of 2003, I mean, the kind of warmongering that was waged by us against Iraq, just in order to steal their oil, just in order to have regime change and have a stronger American presence in the Middle East. Well, that has consequences.
Right.
And,
the only war NATO has won is the information war. You mentioned that in
absolutely.
in your
By
book.
the way, this is the best book in the field, huh? Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, The Great Delusion. He goes into an analysis of the realist, the neo-realist, the constructivist, perspectives on war, and this amazing fantasy of the United States that we have kind of like a God-given right and a mission to bring democracy, human rights, and happiness to the rest of the world. I mean, it's incredible arrogance because the rest of the world doesn't want any of it. They don't want it from us. As General Assembly Resolution 60/1 of 24 October 2005, that was the outcome document of the summit. It says very clearly that nobody owns democracy, and there's not one single model. Certainly not the United States model of democracy. We are not a democracy. We are an oligarchy. In any event, democracy, if anything, we here in Switzerland, I'm also a Swiss citizen, here in Switzerland, we have referenda like 20 times a year. I mean, we're going to have now a new one on the 10th of June. And I vote in every single referendum, etc. We are consulted. We are informed by the government. In the United States, you have a Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and they may differ on some points, basically personal or personality points. But bottom line, we are hawks. Both parties are hawks. They're not interested in peace. They're interested in the business of war. We're war profiteers at the expense, by the way, of the Europeans. It is surrealistic how the Europeans have shot themselves in the foot again and again. That they should do it once or twice, I could even tolerate that. But the fact that when I hear Chancellor Scholz speak, I say the man is mad. I mean, he has screwed his country. He has screwed his country's economy. Well, what can you say? It's hopeless when these really second and third rate politicians occupy positions of power, like Olaf Scholz or like Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron may be a very handsome man, but that's about all you can say for him. I mean, he is, in a way, prettier than Marine Le Pen, but that's not saying much.
Before we came on, Greg was talking about an involvement in Pittsburgh with an anti-war movement trying to get peace in Ukraine. And Greg, recount the story about how they wanted to frame that from the, this is your left group of people trying to stop the war.
It's broader than that, Pat. I mean, we have a group that's been out in the streets every 2 weeks, every month, for years now, against nuclear weapons. And we're particularly targeting one of the local banks, the PNC Bank, because they invest in nuclear weapons. So we're talking about a broad section of Catholic left, Catholic center, actually, but people that are committed, pacifist, to anti-war, to anti-nuclear war, and most importantly, to peace. And so we're trying to organize, because of the situation in Ukraine. Some of the folks have seen the headlines around 500,000 people dying. They're, of course, alarmed, and they want the war to just stop. And so we have part of the conventional left in the United States that's linked up with the Democratic Party in particular, and they come forward and they say, you can't make a demand for peace or negotiate now. You've got to put Russia out in front of that demand. And that's what they're insisting upon. And of course, to my pleasure, most of our left, most of our group have come down on this person and saying, no, we want to stop the war. We don't want to grind your axes in our movement. But that's typical in the United States today. There's no anti-war movement here. There's no peace movement here. And it's all logjam because of this picking of sides. Well, I'm on Russia's side. I hope Russia will win this. No, it's a self-determination question for Ukraine. They must be able to determine their own fate. All put on a very simple picture and all creating this logjam. Whereas the broad general peace movement theme from historically is peace now. Let's just have a peace. And I think, that's what we're looking at in terms of this Ukraine crisis. It's frozen our movements, our political movements, and going forth. And I don't see a way out of that. I don't see the UN as being helpful. I don't see human rights regimen
You're
as being
right. The
helpful.
UN is not being helpful. Antonio Guterres has missed one opportunity after another to make a clear statement about this war. Not the blah blah that it is an act of aggression. Of course, it's an act of aggression. But how about the prehistory? I mean, you must realize that the threat of the use of force, and what else is NATO's expansion? If NATO, a military alliance, expands to your very frontier and arms Ukraine to the teeth, that is a menace, an existential menace. And Putin understood it as an existential menace, and he kept reminding the West that enough is enough. And he wanted, and that was the purpose of the two treaties. By the way, if you go on the internet, you can find the treaty drafted by Lavrov for a sustainable peace, a security architecture for Europe. One treaty with NATO, one treaty with the United States. Both very moderate, both very reasonable. In any event, here the root cause of the war, without a doubt, is NATO expansion. And then the immediate cause is the Maidan coup d'etat against the democratically elected president of all Ukrainians, Viktor Yanukovych. And then, over the 8 years, constant violations of the Minsk agreements by Ukraine, notwithstanding the Normandy format, notwithstanding all of the meetings of OSCE, all of the efforts made on the part of Russia to settle this peacefully, to settle it peacefully in accordance with the UN Charter, in accordance with the principles of territorial integrity, the principles of sovereignty, the principles of self-determination of peoples. The Minsk agreement was a good agreement, and it was violated primarily by Ukraine. And then, to top it off, when Zelensky started saying that he was going to attack Donetsk and Lugansk and take them by force, that is the straw that broke the camel's back. Personally, I would not have attacked. I would not have invaded as Putin did. Of course, I don't know enough to say whether the level of threat against Russia was such that it required what you might call preventive or preemptive self-defense. Putin, of course, has invoked preemptive self-defense, except that it doesn't exist in international law. When George W. Bush invoked preemptive self-defense, he was talking nonsense because it doesn't exist. Article 51 of the UN Charter does not allow. You need this initial military aggression, which then you cannot use that as an excuse for an all-out war, as Israel did in 2006 against Lebanon. I mean, if there's been some kind of a skirmish on the border, then you report that to the Secretary General, you report that to the Security Council, and you can respond in kind, keeping the proportionality. But you don't bomb the hell out of Lebanon with cluster bombs, which, by the way, are illegal because they're indiscriminate. violate the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977. In any event, that response by Israel 2006 was clearly illegal. But the response, or rather the aggression of the United States in 2003 against Iraq, which George W. Bush tried to sell to the world as preemptive self-defense, doesn't hold any water. It is just garbage. Now, what I would like to see in the world is another president like Jimmy Carter. I had the honor of meeting Jimmy Carter and being at the Carter Center for conferences, and he autographed many of his books for me, and I kept a good correspondence with him and with his assistant, Professor David Carroll. Here's a man of principle, here's a man of morality, he's a man of ethics. He is a man who really contributed to human rights. And again, the United States has produced great people. And I think Jimmy Carter belongs in that category. I think that Richard Falk and Jeffrey Sachs and Steve Kinzer and Dan Kovalik and so many others, William Bloom, you remember William Bloom and his book Killing Hope. These people are people of conscience. They're not people of opportunism. They're not people who are there just simply for the limelight and for the glory of the day. They do have a roadmap to justice in the United States and justice in the rest of the world. But everything by now is penetrated. Everything is corrupted by the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex finances directly or indirectly the think tanks, whether it be the Brookings or the Heritage or the American, well, there's so many NGOs, think tanks, and basically they get money so that they write some legalistic text that will give you the impression that what the government is doing is legal. Not only legal, it's moral. Not only moral, it is compatible with human rights, etc. It is dismaying to witness the level to which we have regressed.
Right.
We have a.
You said in your book you're either with us or you're against us, and I would like you to elaborate. I learned a lot from your book about why we can't just take Putin and take him to The Hague, and George Bush and take him to The Hague, and all of these other people that have committed these obvious war crimes in how they directed the policy. Why, when you're bombing civilians, why can't we have some sense of accountability as we did at the end of World War II? And you mentioned that's because they had an unconditional surrender, and that we just don't have the apparatus to make people accountable for atrocities. Our side, their side, just it seems like such a simple solution to the problem. Just at a certain point.
I have always been rather skeptical about the value of international criminal law and of the value of the International Criminal Court. You see, if you had a thoroughly independent, impartial, knowledgeable court that would judge without double standards all violations of the Geneva and Hague Conventions, then I would believe in the ICC. But the ICC started badly and has gone from bad to worse. The ICC is no more than a neo-colonial tool that has been used hitherto against African ousted leaders and military, but was never used against Benjamin Netanyahu or against Ariel Sharon or against Mohammed bin Salem or against the Azerbaijani President Aliyev or against any Western leader. Certainly Tony Blair and George W. Bush deserve to be tried and convicted. But again, punishment does not bring the dead back to life, nor does it undo the enormous devastation that war visits on the victims, especially in a proxy war like the one in Ukraine. That's why my 10-point blueprint for peace does not provide for a role of the International Criminal Court in prosecuting Putin or Zelensky, or for that matter, Jens Stoltenberg. I believe that violations of the Geneva Conventions should be investigated and prosecuted by each army's legal division. That is an obligation. In all four Geneva Conventions of 1949, there are always 3 or 4 articles at the end of the convention imposing an obligation on each party to investigate all reports of war crimes and to try their own. That would give credibility to it. But when it is
Alfred,
separate, yeah.
Let me interrupt you. You speak about who's going to guard the guardians. I think that's a pregnant statement, and it really is what we're kind of evading here. We have a long history, a century-long history of great power politics. And every international institution that's been created has been dominated by the great powers. Isn't the answer lie in terms of explaining to people how the great powers operate? What is it that drives the great powers? That's not a feature of the UN or the League of Nations or any other, Amnesty International. They don't delve into that, and they can't delve into that. But are we doing a disservice by placing them in between, revealing to people and impressing upon people that we live in an era of great power politics, and they're going to dominate these international institutions, whether it's the courts, the UN, whether it's going to be the forces that go into Africa to enforce things. We dominate all that. The great powers do. There's a tendency today, I think, for people to understand how the United States has been the big dominator. But it's not just it's always been big powers. And if the US weren't there, there'd be another big power, the UK, whatever. So how do we get to the root cause? How do we get people to react to great power politics?
Well, information. If the American people were aware of the abuses committed by Washington, by Brussels, by London, by Berlin, by Moscow, etc., if they knew how the game is being played, they would probably judge differently, because the mainstream media has been projecting a narrative that is a cocktail of fake news and fake history and fake law. And I am very concerned about the level of brainwashing of the American people. And what I would like to see the American people, a larger percentage of the American people, watching programs like your program, watching Max Blumenthal, watching Aaron Mate, watching Gray Zone and Pushback and the Real News Network and Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! And The Intercept, etc., and informing themselves. I mean, of course, most people are concerned with their families, their wife, children, grandchildren, etc., how to make ends meet, etc. They're not interested in international politics. Very few people are interested in international politics, so that's not where it's at. On the other hand, government has an obligation to consult the population on essential questions. That is the essence of democracy. I mean, if without all of the war propaganda and all of the fake news given by New York Times, CNN, etc., if the American people had been asked in January, February 2022, do you want the United States to send $100 billion of military aid to Russia, or would you prefer that $100 billion be spent for education and healthcare and infrastructure? I have no doubt what the answer of the American people would have been. On the other hand, that question is never posed. It's not posed in the United States. It's not posed in Germany. It's not posed in the United Kingdom. They assume that representative democracy means that if there is a parliament, the parliament can make the decision on behalf of you. But of course, my senator doesn't represent me. My congresswoman doesn't represent me. Do you really believe in this fantasy? But most Americans seem to believe in it. And the only way we can get out of this impasse, the only way we can solve this or answer this question, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who will guard over the guardians, only ourselves. And that's why I have been an advocate for many years of a proposal that many presidents, including Jimmy Carter, used to like, the idea of a world parliamentary assembly, of a civil society parliamentary assembly. Because, again, I worked in the system for so many years that I know the diplomats do not necessarily represent the interest of their respective peoples. I mean, the diplomats are elites who are not necessarily committed to the truth or to justice. They are committed to keeping the elites in power. And so my, shall we say, respect for diplomats is always mellowed by the realization that they belong to a special class. That's why I would like to democratize more the exercise of power, and a world parliamentary assembly or United Nations Parliamentary Assembly with consultative functions that would be consulted by the Secretary General, that would be consulted by the General Assembly, that would be consulted by the Security Council, would be helpful. I mean, we need more people. We need whistleblowers. We need more people like Ed Snowden. As you know, I dedicated my new book, The Human Rights Industry, to the whistleblowers. And if you permit, I will read out to you from the dedication of the book something I very strongly feel about. This book pays tribute to human rights defenders, true human rights defenders, commends the enormous courage of thousands of whistleblowers worldwide, women and men who choose conscience and civic responsibility over personal convenience, risking their lives, liberty, and careers to serve democratic societies and open our eyes to corruption, lies, scams, covers up, and crimes perpetrated by governments, corporations, and financial institutions. Not only governments, I mean, consider corporations and banks, how they have taken the American people for a ride. And I don't know whether you know the names, but I start my list with Julian Assange, Bill Binney, Joe Darby, Antoine Deltour, Thomas Drake, Sybil Edmonds, Daniel Ellsberg, the late Daniel Ellsberg, whom I very much revered, Vera English, Peter Felton. There are enormous numbers of whistleblowers. They get crushed by the American so-called justice system, and they actually do an important service to society by revealing the crimes committed in our name, and then they line in jail for it, including Jeffrey Sterling, 2002 and 2004, who brought out the CIA revelations on Operation Merlin. In any event, I put a list of some 30 whistleblowers, but of course there are hundreds, and we need them more. And I end with a quotation by Eleanor Roosevelt. By the way, I'm a member of a San Francisco-based NGO called Eleanor Lives. Go on the website www.eleanorlives.org, and you will find our proposal for an International Court of Human Rights. You will find a new, shall we say, unitary International Bill of Rights. It's very interactive. We want input from everybody. But look at this quote by Eleanor. True patriotism springs from a belief in the dignity of the individual, freedom and equality not only for Americans, but for all people on earth, universal brotherhood and goodwill, unquote. Now, Eleanor was ahead of her time, and of course, Eleanor was not a saint or perfect, but she did advance a great deal. I was about to say, we Americans have this belief in progress, and there has been a lot of progress in human rights terms. I mean, certainly there's been an enormous advance in the recognition of women's rights. There has been a very welcome progressive abolition of capital punishment. But there's also been regression, and there is regression today. I would say one of the most serious elements of regression is the cancel culture. The moment that you express an opinion that is contrary to the mainstream, you risk losing your job. You risk being ostracized. You risk not getting a promotion or not getting a tenure. I can think of two immediate examples: Ward Churchill in Denver and Norman Finkelstein at DePaul University. I also taught at DePaul University. Now, Norman was probably the most popular professor of political science and of international relations. But what happened? He got into a fight with Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School, and there was an enormous campaign to discredit Norman and to call him an anti-Semite, although he is the son of a survivor from Majdanek, his mother, and a survivor from Auschwitz, his father, born in Brooklyn. In any event, although the faculty had voted unanimously to grant him tenure, the university was blackmailed.
Yeah, we had Norman on. He was just such a wonderful guest. And I'm trying to get Bandy Lee on, who wrote the the psychiatrist that wrote the book about the 21 different professionals that wrote a psychologist that condemned um, or that diagnosed the problem with Trump, and she was canceled also with a Alan Dershowitz project. She was knocked out of Yale Medical School. So
No, it's really a major problem, retrogression
right,
in human rights, because we have ushered in the phenomenon of self censorship. I mean, we have Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in practice. It's not so much Orwell's 1984. It was not so much the Ministry of Truth and the Ministry of Love, etc. No. I mean, people actually quite softly and gradually have learned to accept this, and they have withdrawn. They have accepted the fact that they are numbers, that they are consumers, that they have no identity. And that is a huge tragedy, but that is what has happened to us. And there is a retrogression in many other fields. For me, squandering money for weapons when education is going downhill in the United States. It's going downhill rapidly in Germany. I mean, I've read studies about that. That is serious. But the mainstream media, which is, of course, owned by the conglomerates, etc., and they depend on the military-industrial complex, they're not going to publish you or me. I mean, in my 6 years as UN rapporteur, I was unable to place one single op-ed in the New York Times or in the Washington Post, and I sent many. I was unable to be interviewed by CNN or any of these mainstream outfits because I don't sing the song they want me to sing. Right. So they don't give me a platform. And what happens to me happens to many others. And Jeffrey Sachs, whom I very much revere, Jeffrey Sachs was even yanked off the air when he was talking in Bloomberg, and he was mentioning the fact that very probably it was the United States that was behind the blowing up of Nord Stream. Well, all hell broke loose, and they yanked him off. So that kind of direct censorship, I've never had that experience because I'm just not big enough. I'm not important.
Well, now that you've been on our podcast, this will you may get invited on MSNBC. I don't know. Who knows? We'll see. We'll see. Hey, Greg, do you have any final thoughts? Do you want to wrap things up with any final thoughts?
I can't imagine we could find a more informed, more erudite discussant of these issues around international policy, UN, global politics than Alfred. It's been a seminar, and I really appreciate it. I'm glad you agreed to come on with us, and I hope we can maybe do this again.
Yeah. I agree. Your books were I just devoured them. They were wonderful. And we'll save for next time when you hitchhiked across the United States in 1970, as did I, as did I, and we can talk about what it was like going through Wyoming with a ponytail.
So. Yeah, how I froze in Yellowstone Park because I didn't have proper clothes.
All right, well we'll get back to that. So, listen, thank you. This has just been. It's just been great. You're a real treasure, and maybe we'll chat with you again when you do your next book next year, as you seem to be. Are you on another book?
I'm on another book, but you will be surprised what it is. I'm a translator.
You have seven languages, right?
Okay, yes, and I love translating as a form of therapy. There was a time when I was being mobbed pretty badly. And I started translating Rilke into English. I've also translated Rilke into French and into Spanish, but I published the first complete translation of Rilke's second cycle of poems called Ladenopfer, which did very well. It's still in print with Red Hen Press in Los Angeles. And because of that book, I was discovered by Suhrkamp in Germany. And they asked me whether I would want to translate Hermann Hesse's 220 poems collection called Das Lied des Lebens, the Song of Life. It's a wonderful collection. People know Hermann Hesse because of his novels, Siddhartha, and Demian, and Glasperlenspiegel, etc. They don't know him as a poet. He's a wonderful poet, very sensitive. And well, I did the 220 translations. And now I'm going through them one by one, because translations that I did 3 months ago, I read them again and say, not exactly. It's not quite. So it's taken me a while, and I hope that in 2-3 months' time, I will be able to deliver the 220 poems to Suhrkamp Verlag, and that they will put it out in, like my Rilke translation, one side, the original German, the other side, my translation. But it is actually, I'll send you a couple just to have a taste. I think there's one poem of his which I think is breathtaking in its simplicity. It says, before the world sinks in wars and wrongs, let us rejoice in the things that do remain, water the frail flowers, sing them songs. The image of singing songs to little flowers, I just love that line. And it's a poem called Late Summer, which actually applies to us right now. I'll send you the Late Summer poem.
That's a good place to stop.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye now.
My pleasure.